The lore of the Black Death, the plague that changed history forever. There are moments in history when the world does not simply change, it breaks. The Black Death was one of those moments. In the middle of the 14th century, something invisible moved across continents with unstoppable force. It entered ports, villages, castles, monasteries, and crowded cities. It crossed mountains, rivers, kingdoms, and empires. It spared no class, no age, no prayer, no wall. In just a few years, tens of millions were dead. Families vanished. Entire towns fell silent. Priests collapsed beside the sick. Kings watched their realms unravel. The old world, built on certainty, faith, hierarchy, and order, suddenly found itself powerless before disease. But the Black Death was not just a plague. It was a turning point. It shattered medieval society, transformed religion, rewrote economies, weakened feudalism, changed labor forever, and left psychological scars that would haunt Europe for centuries. This is the lore of the Black Death, the plague that changed history forever. To understand the Black Death, we have to understand the world it invaded. Europe in the early 1300s was already fragile. This was a deeply religious world where life was shaped by the church, by kings, by local lords, and by the rhythms of agriculture. Most people lived in villages. Most people were poor. Most people worked the land. Survival depended on harvests, weather, and obedience. And that world had begun to crack. In the years before the plague, Europe was hit by famine, economic pressure, overcrowding, and war. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already weakened millions. Crop failures and hunger left bodies thinner and communities more vulnerable. In many places, people were already living on the edge. Then came expanding trade. Trade routes connected Europe to the wider world more than ever before. Goods moved across the Mediterranean, through the Black Sea, across caravan trails from Asia, and into the growing port cities of Europe. But trade was not just carrying silk, spices, and silver. It was carrying death. The Black Death did not appear out of nowhere. Most historians trace its origins to Central Asia or regions farther east, where the bacterium Yersinia pestis circulated among rodent populations. It was a disease of animals long before it became a terror of human civilization. The deadly chain likely began with fleas. Fleas fed on infected rodents, especially rats. When those rodents died, the fleas searched for new hosts. That is when human beings entered the story. From there, the plague traveled along the arteries of empire and commerce. It moved through caravan routes. It passed through trading cities. It reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, where one of the most famous plague stories emerged. According to later accounts, during a siege, diseased corpses may have been hurled over the city walls. Whether every detail is true or not, one thing is certain: the plague was in motion. From the Black Sea, merchant ships carried it westward. And on those ships, beneath the wood, in the cargo, in the grain, in the dark corners where no one looked, rats traveled with fleas. The disease crossed the sea in silence. By 1347, plague ships had arrived in Mediterranean ports. Europe was about to descend into nightmare. Imagine the scene. A ship enters harbor. The crew is sick or dead. Some statter ashore, others never rise. At first, no one fully understands what they are seeing. Fevers, swelling, vomiting, blood, bodies collapsing with terrifying speed. Then it spreads. In Sicily, in Genoa, in Venice, in Marseille, from port cities into inland towns, from village roads into the heart of kingdoms. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims developed sudden fever, weakness, chills, and pain. Then came the buboes, swollen, painful lumps in the groin, armpits, or neck. In some cases, skin darkened from internal bleeding, helping to give the plague its later name, the Black Death. For many, death came within days. Some forms of plague were even worse. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs and spread through the air in droplets. That meant infection could pass directly from person to person. Septicemic plague spread through the bloodstream with brutal speed. This was not a disease medieval society was prepared to understand. There were no microscopes, no germ theory, no antibiotics, no real medical defense, only fear. And the fear grew faster than the bodies could be buried. As the plague spread, normal life began to disintegrate. Markets emptied, church bells rang constantly, houses were abandoned, parents feared children, neighbors avoided neighbors. In some places, people locked themselves indoors. In others, they fled, only to carry the disease farther. The living could barely keep up with the dead. Mass graves appeared. Carts rolled through streets collecting bodies. Burial rites were shortened or abandoned. Priests died administering last rites. Doctors, helpless and exposed, often died too. Medical explanations at the time were desperate and confused. Some blamed bad air, others blamed planetary alignments. Some believed the plague was divine punishment for human sin. People burned herbs, carried flowers, wore charms, or turned to bloodletting and folk remedies. None of it stopped the dying. The Black Death did more than kill individuals. It broke trust. The old medieval system rested on the idea that God had ordered the world, that the church mediated salvation, that rulers governed under divine purpose, and that society, though harsh, made sense. But what happened when prayer didn't save the pious? What happened when priests died like everyone else? What happened when the sacred order seemed unable to explain the horror? For many, faith deepened. For others, it cracked. And once that crack began, history would never be the same. When human beings cannot explain terror, they search for someone to blame. The Black Death unleashed not only disease, but paranoia. Rumors spread that wells had been poisoned, foreigners were accused, outsiders were targeted. Jewish communities, in particular, were falsely blamed in many regions, leading to persecution, torture, expulsions, and massacres. This was one of the darkest consequences of the plague. Fear turned into violence. At the same time, extreme religious movements appeared. Groups of flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public, believing that suffering would earn God's mercy. Their processions were dramatic, emotional, and frightening, a public display of guilt, apocalypse, and desperation. In the plague years, Europe became a landscape of contradictions. Some people became more devout, others fell into fatalism. Some abandoned morality altogether, convinced that death was near anyway. Feasting, drinking, and reckless pleasure became for some a response to doom. If the world was ending, why not live without restraint? The plague did not create human fear. It exposed how fragile civilization becomes when fear takes control. The numbers remain staggering even today. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death is believed to have killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, the total death toll may have reached tens of millions. In some cities, mortality was catastrophic. Entire communities were erased. Some villages were never rebuilt. Some fields were left empty for generations. And because records from the period are incomplete, the true number may be even more horrifying than we can measure. This was not a normal epidemic. This was one of the deadliest biological disasters in human history. A catastrophe so vast that it changed not just the map of population, but the structure of civilization itself. When so many people die, labor becomes power. That was one of the great consequences of the Black Death. Before the Black Death, much of Europe operated under feudal systems. Peasants and serfs were tied to land and to lords. Labor was abundant. Workers had little leverage. Life was hard, and social mobility was limited. Then the population collapsed. Suddenly, there were not enough workers to harvest crops, maintain estates, build infrastructure, or serve the nobility. Surviving laborers became far more valuable. Wages began to rise. Lords who had once controlled everything now found themselves competing for workers. In some places, governments tried to freeze wages and force people back into old roles, but history had shifted. The labor shortage weakened the foundations of feudalism. The plague had turned death into bargaining power. Peasants could demand more. Workers could move. Land changed hands. The old order did not vanish overnight, but it was no longer untouchable. In a strange and brutal irony, one of the worst disasters in human history helped create conditions for profound social change. The Black Death also changed the way people imagined existence itself. Death became impossible to ignore. Art, literature, and religious imagery grew darker. Skeletons, decay, judgment, and the fragility of life became central themes. The famous idea of the danse macabre, the dance of death, reflected a terrifying truth. King and peasant, priest and laborer, rich and poor, all were equal before the grave. This was a world obsessed with mortality, because mortality was everywhere. And yet, from that darkness came transformation. The plague shook confidence in old institutions. It forced societies to reconsider medicine, authority, labor, faith, and the meaning of order. Over time, the long shadow of the Black Death helped shape the conditions that would lead toward the late medieval transformation of Europe, the decline of rigid feudal relations, and eventually the dawn of a more modern age. The plague destroyed, but it also revealed. It revealed how connected the world already was. It revealed how vulnerable power truly is. And it revealed that even the strongest civilization can be brought to its knees by something too small to see. The Black Death was more than a medieval horror. It was a force that rewrote history. It arrived on trade routes and left behind a broken world. It emptied cities, shattered families, weakened kingdoms, transformed labor, challenged faith, and filled the imagination of Europe with death for generations. Long after the bodies were buried, its effects remained. In the fields, in the churches, in the laws, in the economy, in the art, in the memory of civilization itself. Because some events are not remembered simply for the number of lives they take. They are remembered because they divide history into before and after. And the Black Death was one of them. It was not just the plague that killed millions. It was the plague that changed the world forever.